Hello, penguins and popsicles. My name is TV Sky, and I may be, a week or two late on this one, but Ashe Warmother has had its second issue finally published, and I thought maybe we should actually have a little bit of a look at it. These comic collaborations are interesting to me for a number of reasons. First of all, because of the stories they tell, which is the primary subject of the video today, but also because they mark the first time that Riot have really, truly, honestly had to play nice with a third-party partner when it comes to developing some part of their IP. Traditionally, when it comes to producing League of Legends lore material, they've brought in outside studios as contractors on their own internal projects, but they've never really had to give a full license to another company the way that they have had to with the League of Legends IP, the League of Legends license, and several League of Legends characters that they've signed over to Marvel in a very limited context for these comics. And the reason why that's kind of a big deal is because Riot have legendarily been massively protective of their IP, like really, truly, genuinely unwilling to exploit it to its fullest extent. And some of that is principle, and some of that is just stubbornness. It's part of the reason why there isn't already a Netflix show, why there isn't already a Saturday morning cartoon, why there isn't already a line of lunchboxes and plushies and backpacks and, t-shirts branded with League of Legends characters. It's because Riot have simply not been willing to grant the kinds of licenses and permissions that are necessary to make that kind of thing happen. And on the one hand, it's admirable restraint from Riot that they haven't already been milking the League of Legends license dry by slapping their characters on every physical product that could possibly be sold to customers. But on the other hand, it's also a big part of the reason why we have 140 characters in League of Legends, the vast majority of whom do not have stories that are actively doing anything at most points in time. And you can say what you want about the rather laissez-faire attitude that Games Workshop takes to granting licenses to the 40k universe, and you can say what you want about most of the Star Wars expanded universe output being, mediocre to kind of bad, but one thing you can't say is that either of those universes have a poverty of stories being told. There are always novels coming out, there are always comics being made, there are always video games in the works, there's always something new to look forward to in those universes, and that, to me, has really been one of the major flaws for the League of Legends universe, is that so many characters, and for such a long time, there's nothing to look forward to. You can't expect any of them to get developed. You can't expect any of their universes or their stories to expand. You can only expect the limited staff and experience and knowledge and expertise that Riot has to be put towards so many projects at a time, and it will never be sufficient. So I'm not saying that I expect Riot to all of a sudden go all Games Workshop and just sub-license the League of Legends universe to 100 different game studios, most of which never deliver a decent product, but it surely would be nice if the collaboration with Marvel is a signal that in the future, Riot are willing to grant their license to a few more companies so that we can get just a little bit more material in this wonderful but terribly stale fantasy universe. Anyway, that's a really long extended tangent to go on in the preamble, so let's actually now talk about Ashe Warmother Issue 2, the comic that this video is technically about. So, Warmother Issue 2. We are going to get into spoilers for the issue right now, of course, so if you haven't read it yet, just go to the League of Legends Universe website. It's free on there. There's really no reason not to read it if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So let's get to talking about what actually happens in the comic, what it means, and let's talk a little bit about the artwork, because it's really good and I have a lot of stuff to say about it. So the comic, the story managed to surprise me, because I had assumed when I first saw this thing that it was going to be the new origin story for Ashe, and therefore finding the bow would be the logical endpoint, or the logical climax of the story, with some kind of an epilogue showing how she unites the tribes and creates the Avarosan and all the other stuff starts rolling. But I would have thought that the journey to find the bow would have been the main meat of the story. Not so much. We find the bow at the end of Act 2 of this story, which means I'm quite fascinated and interested to see what the next two acts are actually going to be about. I had assumed that the story would go something like Ashe and her mother out on the journey, and then she loses her mother and she has to go on alone, and she finds, the grand tomb of Avarosan, and she goes inside and she's solving puzzles and learning about the true history of the Freljord, and all kinds of shocking secrets are coming to light, and you get this big, grand revelation of the true history. How Lissandra is actually betrayed, and Ashe gets that knowledge, and then the traitors follow her in, and she has to deal with the traitors in there, and she's the only one who can actually open the tomb of Avarosa, because she's the only one who knows all the legends that her mother knew, and it was going to be this whole Ashe is the Chosen One special thing, where only she can open the tomb and claim the bow and claim Avarosa's legend, because she is the special one who has, the lore knowledge that was handed down from her mother, and I thought that that was going to be the legacy that Ashe's mother left her. Because Ashe's mother dies in this issue, by the way, so there's obviously going to be a reckoning with the legacy of her motherhood in Ashe's own life, and I thought the thing that she was going to be like, she had left Ashe with all this knowledge of ancient Freljordian history, which was going to be really, really important for her as she grew into a leader on her own and grew into someone who could actually oppose the death cult of Lysandra. Not so much, though. We don't get that grandiose tomb. We don't get, that massive sort of ancient secrets of the Freljordian past moment. We get a pile of rocks on a lake of frozen corpses. Thematically, that's pretty important to this version of Ashe, this new version of Ashe, that it's not really that she ran into some grand destiny that ordains her the true leader of the good people of the Freljord, and so that, now we stand against Lysandra and we expose the lies of the past and we build a better Freljord for the tomorrow because the destinies and the fates have foreseen that Avarosa shall return. Like, none of that is actually there. It's just a pile of rocks, and there happens to be a magical bow in it, but is it Avarosa's? Who can say? The version of Ashe that they're showing us, that they're building for us for the future, isn't one who is driven by a profound internal certainty of their role in fate and destiny, a profound certainty in the grandness and the justness of their vision. She's someone who's driven by a knowledge that what's going on right now isn't sustainable. It can't be allowed to go on because it kills people. It kills her mother. It kills the people of the Freljord. What they have now isn't good enough. It has to be changed, but it's not preordained by the gods. It's not something that's determined by history. It's something that she has to do for herself, and that certainly makes for a much more interesting characterization. We've talked about that before when we've talked about Ashe's lore previously, is that this version of Ashe is, as a character, a lot more interesting. She has a lot more conflict. She has a lot more fallibility. She has a lot more weaknesses, rather than the really, honestly, rather empty, flat, oh, the destiny of Avarosa, and we shall lead the people to the grand new thing, and something, like the Ashe that we have in-game right now, with all of her, resplendent confidence and, her constant self-certainty. She's not an uncool character, but she's not nearly as interesting. There's not as much you can do with her as you can with someone who is still, at their heart, a young girl who was thrust into leadership without adequate preparation and put through this gauntlet of, trauma and loss, and who has to try and process that and their own weaknesses while also trying to be a good leader for their people. There's a lot more meat on them, their bones. And this ties into some of the stuff that's been indicated in the other lore updates to Ashe, indeed, and also the previous issue of Warmother, that the whole legend of Ashe, the whole legendary throne of Avarosa, all that destiny stuff, that wasn't something that she came up with for herself. That was something that was imposed on her by the expectations of other people. We see that especially in the latest Ashe lore update story, that her role and her leadership, in the heart of the Avarosan tribe, is based on not so much a lie, but just on other people conveniently rewriting legends to fit the image of an Avarosan reborn, of Avarosa reborn, of a savior that has reincarnated to, fix all the problems of the Freljord, which is not really who Ashe is, or even who she wants to be, but she's taking the opportunity to do something good with the power that is available to her. And that's, it's a really good concept, but it does leave me wondering, when the actual hell is Ashe going to get an in-game update that reflects any of this? Like, she really, I've always harped on about Ashe's character design being kind of crappy, because in-game right now it is, but good lord, with all of these lore changes, the character that she is in-game is just even less interesting and even less appropriate for the current state of the character. She needs a voice update, she needs a character design update, she needs even some ability updates, I think, that more accurately reflect her role as, a beleaguered leader just trying to do the best she can for her people, struggling against adversity, than the character that she is right now. I don't know if Riot is actually planning any of that. They have historically not been great at updating characters in-game when major things happen to them in the story. Cough, cough, misfortune. But, I mean, a boy can at least hope that they will bring in the voice actor to maybe record a different take on the character. That would certainly be nice, since they're putting all this effort into this collaboration with Marvel. It's a bit of a waste if none of that is ever reflected inside the actual game. Anyway, back to the actual story of the comic. Malcolm's betrayal was good. I think that one was actually genuinely good. It was genuinely not telegraphed to me in issue 1 that he was going to be like an obvious traitor of some sort. He acts as a voice of reason. He seems to be entirely benevolent, even though, of course, knowing he's a frost priest, which means he works for Lysandra, maybe it's obvious that the dude is a bad guy, especially since all of his magic is presented in pure black, which, you know, not historically the hero color. The way that he was framed by the artwork and the writing in the first issue didn't give away the game that he was going to be the obvious traitor who's, you know, leading Ashe's tribe into doom just because they were apparently closer than anyone thought to finding the throne of Avarosa, and Lysandra, for obvious reasons, does not want that. But the really good thing about the way that the betrayal of Malcolm is portrayed is the way that his character comes across when his betrayal is unveiled, because he thinks he's the hero in this scenario. So when he's confronting Ashe on the glacier, after having murdered most of her tribe, her fathers and her mother, he's treating her like she is being the unreasonable party, like she did something wrong. He's talking about how he was trying so hard behind the scenes to save them, and you only stayed alive because I convinced Lysandra that I could get your mother to abandon her quest, and I sacrificed so much, and it was so hard for me to pretend, and I never wanted to do any of this. Can't you see how this entire situation is really about how bad I feel? And it all culminates with him crying like some kind of tragic hero as he's trying to throttle Ashe to death. He's trying to murder a girl who did absolutely nothing wrong, and he's crying like he's the one who's going through terrible pain and making a terrible sacrifice. That is a good way to write a compelling traitor. Because I think we've all encountered at some point in our lives a person who's a little bit like that. Someone who will hurt other people, who will betray them, who will, you know, be looking out for their own self-interest, and then when they're called out on their nonsense, they will look around betrayed and hurt and go, who, me? No, I had to do it. You don't understand how hard it's been for me to do all these terrible things that I definitely didn't want to do and certainly don't benefit me. No, I am the real victim here. Now, besides just being a really good way to build a heel-turn villain into someone who you will cheer for when they get stabbed in the chest with a giant crystal arrow, it also does a lot to establish the menace of Lysandra's death cult. Like, this is the kind of mindset that she engenders in her followers. She turns them into informants and betrayers with the religious assurance that they are being the real heroes here, that they are always doing the right thing when they look out for her interests. And that, you know, that gives you some sense of just the kind of, I hesitate to say Orwellian, but the very paranoid mindset that you kind of have to have in the Freljord in order to survive if you are not aligned directly with Lysandra's interest, is that her spies are always watching. Her religious cult is always there keeping an eye on you, ready to report you to their dark mistress. The story The Eye in the Abyss gave us a good insight into what it's like to be a frost guard and work for Lysandra, but this comic gives us a little bit of insight in what it's like to not be a frost guard, what it's like to not work for Lysandra, and to always be looking over your shoulder for anything that might set her followers off. So yeah, I do really genuinely enjoy the story of Ashe Warmother so far. I think it's doing a really good job of world building for the Freljord and building out this new version of Ashe's character in a compelling way that's really easy to sympathize with. Like, I really want to see what happens to her next, like how her mentality develops, how the tragedies that she's been through affect her, and I'm looking forward very much to issues 3 and 4, and I hope that they'll follow up on it a little bit more, in-game or out of it, with more stories about Ashe and the Freljord and Sejuani and Lysandra and how these three characters come to clash. So, finally, let's talk a little bit about the artwork in this comic, because it's pretty top-notch. Nina Vacueva, who is the primary artist on the thing, is someone who I followed for a long time. They're called Sir Panger on Twitter. You really should go follow their Twitter and all their other stuff, because they're really, really good. And this comic is no different. Now, from the last issue, this time, I feel like she has a very loose style. Like, she really works with the very pencil-like, scratchy style that she's got going on to create some really nice, expressive characters. And especially her mastery of, like, clothes and texture and hair, which we'll talk about later, is just, mwah, it's gorgeous. And in this second issue, I feel like her style has loosened up a little bit. It feels a little bit like she's more comfortable with all of the subjects that she's working with. She's more comfortable about getting a little bit more loose and letting loose with the artwork, and it's really, the effect is really nice. There's a few pages, for instance, where she when Ashe is pulling her mother up from the ground as the enemy is charging at them, Ashe's mother's face is rendered with just these few little shapes that barely give you any hint of the expression, and yet it's a really good expressive version of rendering that face. And Vacueva often achieves great effects by as much by what she doesn't show as what she does choose to show. And I really like this, like that the comic is not super cleanly rendered, that it's not really super slick and super nice looking. That also really works with the Freljord aesthetic, which is all, you know, Vikings and hardscrabble lives and, you know, living amongst these ancient ruins and this ice-blasted hellscape of a world like that. It works really well with the aesthetic of the story, but it's just also... it's really good to look at. Like, one of the things I do get frustrated about with superhero comics sometimes is just how slick and clean and, air quotes, nice looking a lot of the artwork can be that makes it feel rather lifeless. For me, the expression of an artist often happens in how they sketch things, and these pages are this wonderful blend of finished, absolutely gorgeous renderings that really, really work. They don't ever feel messy. They don't ever feel incomplete or unfinished, but they also retain a lot of the personality of feeling that little bit of scribbliness that I really, really like about Wakueva's work. It's just, it's really good. Something we talked about last time is just how good Wakueva is at creating and rendering hair and showing like the weight and the heft and the fall of hair, which is something that gives her characters a hell of a lot of expression, especially Grenna, and certainly later in this comic also Ashe. The challenge of drawing hair is that in reality, of course, hair is made up of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of tiny little individual strands, all of which can behave individually, but in order to stylize it, you have to turn those strands into chunks of hair that you can then point in different directions in order to give it, you know, to give it shape, in order to give it texture, and Wakueva is just so good at making those choices, making those specific decisions about how both to make the hair seem shaggy and fuzzy and like it's made up of individual strands while not sacrificing the ability to stylize and keep everything nice and tidy. It's just, looking at the hair and the fur and all the fuzz in this comic just makes me happy on a fundamental level because it's just so good. Hair is also narratively important to these comics because where pretty much everyone in the story has some kind of long hair, whether it's long beards or long hair, and Ashe's mother Grenna, one of the visual signifiers of her power is that grand mane of hair that she's got on her head with all these iron rings braided into it. That's a symbol of her leadership, whereas Ashe's, you know, bright but rather thin hair is a symbol of like, the fact that she's not quite grown into the mantle of a leader just yet, and all the Viking warriors have these big beards and mustaches and stuff, and Malcolm, one of the things that sets him apart as an outsider is the fact that he has this close-cropped hair and no facial hair whatsoever, and it all just works really well to establish the character designs of these characters. And of course, when Ashe transforms, when she finds the bow, when the unleashed power of perhaps the bow of Avarosa courses through her, it turns her hair white, it turns her into the white-haired warrior who we know from the game today, and that moment of epic transformation is not like a Sailor Moon-esque transformation sequence happening out in space. It's a simple sequence of panels where we can see her hair being whipped around in the wind of this unleashed power, slowly transitioning into white. It is less a Super Saiyan transformation as it is a sort of gliding transition into power, which I just think is really compelling, and which wouldn't work half as well if Wakueva wasn't so damn good at rendering these strands properly. On the downside, I do have to say that the action choreography in this particular issue didn't really work for me. The fights are a little bit weirdly static. They don't really look as dynamic and alive as I would like them to be. The movement, I think, isn't really there. It's not really clear in a particular clash or a particular fight scene exactly what the combatants are doing, and therefore it becomes hard for me to be invested in, you know, the back and forth of the combat, especially the moment where Grenna is holding off the attacking raiders. It's like, this is supposed to be the moment of epic sacrifice for Ashe's mom, like where she really gets to show off a last moment of badassery, a last stand, and it just doesn't quite come across that way, partly because the page count of this particular issue doesn't give it enough room to breathe, which is really not the artist's fault, but also because just the action choreography on display here is just not very clear. Like, there's a lack of clear directionality to the action. I think there's a lack of clear weight to a lot of the action. And by this is just a minor note, but one little peculiar quirk of this comic is that the handles of various weapons in the story tend to be really weirdly thin, and I'm thinking in particular of this panel of Ashe's mother. She is the spear and the axe. Those are her two primary weapons. Her axe looks fine, but then the spear that she's holding in the other hand looks like a toothpick. Like, it's tiny. It looks like I could snap it in half with two fingers. It's really, really small and tiny, and I think the idea there is that it's a spear of true ice, like the whole thing is made of true ice, and therefore it doesn't need to be thick, but it just makes the weapon seem profoundly unimpressive and not very powerful, which goes entirely against the impression we're supposed to have of Grenna herself as being someone who is tremendously overwhelming and tremendously powerful. So there is a little bit of a visual disconnect there that just, it's not, I wouldn't call it like a deal breaker of any kind on her character design, but the fact that her weapon looks so fragile, it doesn't really work for me personally anyway. But the biggest moment where I think that the relatively static artwork does the story a disservice is in the climactic moment when Ashe triumphs over Malcolm, when she picks up the bow and fires what is probably her first crystal arrow. Like, I think that may have been a first ultimate. I think that's what we're supposed to take away from it. But just the way that things are rendered and the way that things are posed and the perspective that's chosen and the page layout, it just doesn't really sell it for me. Like, this is really where I think there could have been some benefit to going full anime for a second and really go for a lot more distortion to the scene, like a lot more speed lines, a lot more, speed blurring on things, a much more powerfully distorted perspective that really sort of pumps up the epic grandeur of the tableau, rather than this relatively static shot of two characters standing not too far apart and an arrow that hasn't actually pierced him yet, but which is just kind of lightly touching his chest, something that has a little bit more visceral power to it, something with a little bit more punch in it. And part of the reason why I think so is that one of the major points that's being made in this scene is that Ashe has picked up this bow and it has allowed her to survive, but she's picking up a lot of power that comes with a lot of consequences. It comes with a heavy cost, a really heavy price, a really heavy burden. And that's what the next page does so brilliantly, is that it shows us where exactly this entire fight has been taking place, that they have been standing on top of this frozen lake of nothing but corpses, just dead people imprisoned within ice underneath her feet, showcasing that, like, she's literally walking over the graves of hundreds of people in order to carry this bow with her into the next part of her adventure. It's a visual symbol of just how heavy the burden, just how heavy the cost of what she has obtained has really been. And the best way to make a juxtaposition like that really work is to juxtapose, like, first have this moment of completely just joyous, rapturous, full-blown power trip. Yeah, I have the bow, I have the power, I can do the great thing, I can beat the traitor, yeah! And then, in the next moment, you hit them with the hammer, kapow! This power comes at a cost. This is not a moment of triumph, this is a moment of terrible, terrible burden. So, yeah. I think that's about all I have to say about issue 2 of Ashe Warmother. We will, of course, be looking at issue 3 once that comes out in issue 4, and we'll try and do a little bit of a wrap-up and a conclusion on what exactly this comic was trying to do for the story of the game and for the story of Ashe as a character. But for the moment, like, it's free, it's online, you can go and read it, and you really should, especially because, just if nothing else, the artwork of Warmother is worth just taking the time to sit down and study it, because the way that she uses line work and color in order to create the texture of her scenes is it's masterful. It's really good to look at. But yeah, I think that's the end of my review. I don't know that I have a great conclusion to go out on, so I'll just say that if you enjoyed this video, then thank you very much, and you can like and subscribe and hit the bell icon and comment and do a lot of other stuff that has something to do with the algorithm that I don't really understand, but which apparently helps me out a lot. If you want to, you can also head on over to Patreon and subscribe to my Patreon and to my work, which is helpful. Like, if you have $1 a month and you don't mind parting with that dollar so I can use it for breakfast sometimes, like, breakfast is good, I haven't had breakfast in a while, then very, very welcome to do so. But if you don't want to do the recurring subscription thing and sign up for a thing that happens every month, and you just want to give me a tip one time, Coffee is the place where you can go for that. There's a link down in the description where you can give me like a one-time tip and say, hey, good job on making the video about the thing, and I would also be very grateful for that. Of course, if you're not in a position to be able to afford to do either of those things, or you just don't want to, I'm just happy that you've watched the video this far. Just watching videos is enough. It is genuinely very helpful, so thank you very much. Of course, if you didn't like this video, that's completely fair, and legends do tell that there is a way for a user who has grown tired and dissatisfied with the offerings on YouTube to express their displeasure in visceral terms. There's an artifact spoken of in hushed tones in the dark rooms at the backs of wizard clubs after hours when no one else is really around except the waiters who no one pays attention to. An artifact of such terrible power that it was hidden away and sealed many eons ago so that no one would ever be tempted to take up its terrible mantle and unleash horror upon the world of online video content creation. They speak of it as the Dislikit Bhutan. Its terrible name has echoed through the centuries, and while none now know where such a terrible item may rest, if you search and you seek, perhaps you shall find it. You shall hear its dark power calling to you on the edge of your perception in the dead of night, and should you follow that call to the ancient tombs and halls beneath the earth of the deserts, then may God have mercy on your soul, for when you take up that dark power, there will be no returning to the land of likes for you. Thank you very much for watching.